Excellent. Thank you for that, Don, and thank you for the support of CANSI for the conference. So tonight we've got a couple of events for you. And the first is a panel on tracking data. And for those of you who've been involved and watching hockey, tracking data has not quite taken hold, though we might hear otherwise in a little bit. Hopefully we'll get an update on where we are, maybe as part of the conference. And so we've turned to some folks who have done some work in some other sports where there is tracking data. So our panel tonight is going to be led by Erica Ayala. She's a freelance multimedia journalist and a hockey analyst for the Premier Hockey Federation. She called her first NHL game on Devils Radio on March 8th of this year, as the Colorado Avalanche took on the New Jersey Devils in Newark, New Jersey. Erica also covers women's basketball and soccer, and her writing has appeared in Forbes, the New York Times, Sports Illustrated, and more. Erica is a New York native who recently relocated to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and is a member of the 2022 winter cohort of the Builders Plus Backers Idea Accelerator Program, a rapid-paced 90-day virtual program fueled by non-dilutive funds. Erica is using her funding to expand her #BlackRosie brand to elevate Black women and melanated creators in sports media. And I'll turn it over to Erica.
All right. Thank you so much, Michael. Great to be here with everyone. And I am really excited to talk to some amazing experts about tracking data. I am very much an eye test person, but I always enjoy learning a lot more about data. And so we have some fantastic people throughout sports that are going to help us do that. So I'm going to introduce them now, and then we'll get cracking. Haha. So we'll start with you, Namita. Namita Nandakumar is currently the senior qualitative analyst for the Seattle Kraken, where she uses statistical tools to inform all aspects of hockey operations and decision-making, Namita previously spent 2 seasons as a qualitative analyst for the Philadelphia Eagles after graduating from Wharton. She has also written publicly about sports analytics research for 538, The Athletic Philadelphia, and Hockey Graphs. Welcome, Namita.
Hello.
Hello there. All right. Also joining us is Aaron Blackshear, the director of analytics for the Minnesota Timberwolves. Prior to joining the Timberwolves, which is National Basketball Association, just to clarify, Aaron spent 4 seasons with the Detroit Pistons, building on their data infrastructure and analytics capabilities. He also spent 15 years in the healthcare industry and is a Kenosha, Wisconsin native and graduated from Carroll College. Welcome, Aaron. Okay, and then also joining us is Seth Partnow, the director of basketball for StatsBomb and an NBA analyst for The Athletic. He's formerly the director of basketball research for the Milwaukee Bucks, also in the NBA, and co-founded the basketball analytics website Nylon Calculus. His first book, The Mid-Range Theory, Basketball's Evolution in the Age of Analytics, was published in November 2021. All right. So we've got everyone on screen now. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. And Namita, we're going to start with you. And first, can you just, when we say tracking data, what exactly are we talking about? And particularly, what does that look like right now in the National Hockey League?
Sure, that's a great question. So essentially, it's location data. So we're talking about the location of all of the players and the puck when they're on the ice. So you can imagine that you will need a lot of frequency of observations of that data to really get a fine understanding of, again, where exactly the players are moving, how fast they're moving, where they are, especially with the puck, given how quickly that travels. So, we have sensors in the pucks and in the players. I assume shoulder pads. Someone feel free to fact check that. But essentially, just getting it again. Tons of observations of where they are more frequently than every second, some multiple of that. And that's pretty similar to how it is across other sports, including the NFL, where they Also, again, have sensors in the players' pads, and in addition to the football. I would say a little bit easier in terms of, I think you need a little less granularity when the sport is a bit slower than, you know, hockey players skating around on the ice and the puck moving as fast as it is. But you can imagine even football travels very quickly. So yeah, that's essentially what it is. It's pretty, probably the largest kind of data that you can have in sports analytics. You can compare that to what a lot of people are used to, which is more just like event-based data. So someone blocked a shot, someone made a hit, someone took a shot, you know, stuff like that. And this is basically the first kind of full season. You know, there have been samples here and there, but the first full season of NHL tracking data that we're getting, and, you know, contrasting that to other sports. I think it's been around, you know, at least for a few years in a lot of other sports, including the NFL, where I was able to work with it previously because it had been basically available in some capacity from 2016 onwards. From 2018 onwards, teams were able to get every other team's tracking data, not just their own. So that's when I was kind of able to do the most with it. And yeah, they're continuing, they're expanding, and I think football and other sports are a really good sort of blueprint for understanding all of the ways that tracking data can impact the NHL and hockey in general.
Namita, thank you so much for that. Aaron, I want to come over to you and we'll talk a little bit about the NBA. So if we're talking about tracking data, as Namita set us up, it seems like some of this is wearable technology, some of it, or, you know, things that are placed in the puck. So the equipment in a hockey game versus the equipment in a basketball game is a little bit different. So can you give us a run and a lay of the land of what tracking data looks like in basketball and the NBA in particular?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, to start off, there are no wearable devices allowed in the NBA, according to, you know, the collective bargaining agreement. So everything is camera based. So there are 2 cameras in the arena. They're capturing the players and the ball 25 times per second. For the players, we get just X and Y coordinates. So, you know, we don't have things like jumps. And for the ball, we get X, Y, and Z. So we know the height of the ball as well. Because it's camera based, you know, they're focusing on the center of mass of the player. And so we don't get things like the orientation of the player, you know, what direction they're facing. We don't get anything about their limbs, what their limbs are doing. We're just getting basically, you know, it's one dot of where the player is and where he's going. But, you know, it's because it's, you know, 25 times per second, you know, it's a lot of data. It's very granular, very accurate, you know, like even though it's camera based, it is, you know, like they do a lot of post-processing on that data. So it's very accurate as far as locations. You know, you'll get the occasional thing, you know, where a player moves, you know, faster than the speed of light, and, you know, but they're cleaning that kind of stuff up so that the data makes sense. But yeah, it's a big difference with the other sports though, in that, you know, like it's obviously going to be much better to have an actual device than, you know, like how the player is oriented. So that is a limitation of the tracking data, but it's still opened up a gold mine of things that we can do with it and to help us really understand what's happening in the game.
And also, Aaron, Namita broke down how long teams have been working with this data and then how long they've had access to other teams' data. What does that look like in the NBA right now?
Sure. Yeah. So we have data going back to the 2013-14 season. The first 3 years, it was run by a company, Stats Inc. It was called SportView at the time. Starting in 2016, a company in a Los Angeles-based company called Second Spectrum became the new provider. So similar system with cameras, but, you know, it's similar, you know, the exact same XY for the players, XYZ for the ball. Second Spectrum, you know, has this army of machine learning engineers then that is, you know, processing all of that data and turning it into more than just coordinates, and, you know, basically turning it into basketball actions and describing what's happening. And so all the teams have had basically the entire time we've had access to every team's data, provided that you're subscribing to the full package. As far as I know, every team now is at least getting like the basic package that includes the basic data. I know as recently as 3 or 4 years ago, there were 1 or 2 holdouts, but I'm pretty sure those teams have bought in now too, and everyone is getting it. And it comes with, you know, you're getting access to the raw coordinate data, all of those, what we call markings, which are, the summarized data into basketball actions. And then also there's a web interface, where you can do simple summaries of all of that data, like someone like myself or Seth, when he was at the Bucks, we're typically working more with the raw data, but there is, for the non-technical users, a really nice web interface where you can get summaries of some of the statistics that are coming out of this data.
Thank you, Aaron. And Seth, as Aaron just mentioned, you have some overlap with the NBA, but also in your role with StatsBomb with other sports as well. So given what we've heard from Namita, given what we've heard from Aaron, where are other sports and how does that compare with what's going on in the NBA and the NHL right now?
I think that kind of the two main kinds of tracking that we see, the camera-based and the sort of the wearables-based, at least at the sort of the top professional levels of sports. Something that kind of I've learned both, with my work in the Bucks and now at StatsBomb is the next sort of frontier is deriving tracking from video, whether broadcast or some other kind of dedicated video source, to be able to generate similar data from leagues where an expensive install of cameras for in the NBA's example, or wearables that the NFL or NHL uses aren't practical. Obviously, there are some other leagues that have enough money that might be possible, but especially as you get into sort of amateur and developmental leagues, it's not really practical or cost effective to do that. Similar information, if for no other reason than to make kind of apples to apples comparisons of players as they sort of move through the system or move from league to league, or if you're trying to examine the play of another league to get some insights.
Yeah, indeed. I appreciate that. And I want to, before we move on, talking specifically about hockey, Namita, there's something that you said, and also with your role with the Seattle Kraken, I'm curious to get an idea, and Seth, you hit on this a little bit also, but what is the value added between this tracking data and what we might consider more play-by-play data, as you mentioned earlier? How is this being used right now? And then Aaron, I'd love for you to answer that same question of how this data is being used in basketball.
Yeah, so I'd say in general, there's a lot of potential for it to be used in a lot of different ways. I think the biggest value add is kind of what I was alluding to earlier, which is, what we have currently, is useful data about like which players are taking a shift, and then whether some sort of discrete event is happening, like a shot, like a hit or a takeaway or giveaway, although, there's a little bit of judgment call in some of those stats as well. And there's 60 minutes in a hockey game, and there's a lot of stuff that can happen that might not be considered an event as such, and might not be sort of tracked, but is useful and valuable, and gives us information as to who's performing well. And I think tracking data can really fill in all of those gaps. I'll say in particular, it's sort of easy to think about offensive stats. You got goals, assists, like that does capture a lot of offense, certainly not all of it. But, if you even have some more augmented play-by-play data, you can look at passing and things like that. Where I think what we have currently really falls short is a lot of on the defensive side. So doing subtle things that, again, you're not going to record an event necessarily, but if you're just cutting down a passing lane, making it so that the opponent can't really get a quality chance off, that's a really great thing to do, but we don't currently always have the data to identify and credit players for doing that. So that's, I think, something that I'm personally really excited to see more of is more robust, like defensive stats in particular. You can even sort of augment this idea of expected goals or scoring chances, if you prefer, to get a better sense of which chances and shots are really truly the most dangerous ones. So yeah, just getting a fuller picture of what's going on the ice, getting a more precise picture of who to credit for doing what. Obviously, all of these things will take time. I'm not suggesting that everyone's, solved it already, but I think especially seeing the impact that tracking data has had in other sports, it really feels like an exciting time.
Okay, now you're talking my language. You mentioned defense. Oh, I have a gripe with defensive stats in every sport ever. So, but Aaron, I said I'd get to you, so let's talk about it.
Yeah, so I mean, it really has. It's changed fundamentally. The way we are able to analyze basketball. Like one of the best things that Second Spectrum does is, like I mentioned earlier, they turn the coordinate data into basketball actions. And so that means things like pick and rolls, drives, post-ups, off-ball screens, all the things that are happening in a basketball game that are not captured in the box score or even in the play-by-play. We're getting the points and the assists and those types of things, but not how they were generated. And so the tracking data allows us to do all of that. And that's been available in the past through, things like Synergy. But, one that's obviously very labor intensive to have people watch every single play of every single game and tag it. And there's also just impossible to remove all of the subjectivity from how those things are tagged, whereas the computer can just do things objectively and, identify those. And, in the early days of having tracking data, there was skepticism, and like, if you're sitting in a room with the coach and you're showing all of the pick and rolls, and then one of them is like maybe not a pick and roll, you might lose the coach. He's like, okay, all of these are wrong. Like, one of them was wrong, so all of them are wrong. But over the years, they've gotten so much more accurate. And obviously, that last 2 to 3% of accuracy is the hardest part. But Second Spectrum is over. As we built up 9 years of this data, they've gotten really, really good at identifying things, and to the point where these days, when I'm doing some of those quality checks, like I don't really find any plays that I think are tagged wrong, or at least not enough, or significantly wrong enough that I'm worried about it. So it really gives us a very accurate picture of what's happening in the game. So those, we call those markings, when they're tagging all of the play types and everything. And then just with the raw data itself, that's still a largely untapped resource. Like some teams are not really doing much with that raw coordinate data at all. Other teams are, rebuilding all the things that Second Spectrum is doing, to try to do it better, to gain an edge over the rest of the league. But that is, like I said, we barely scratched the surface of everything that's available, and then you can get into things like how quickly a player is moving, how quickly he's able to change direction, how quickly he's able to react when the player he's guarding is, trying to drive or come off a screen. You can detect things like fatigue during the game, like are his acceleration slowing down as the game goes on. There's, like I said, it's almost endless the things you can come up with there. It's an unbelievable amount of data, and so it can be really hard to pull those insights out of it. And that's why you see teams all around the league staffing up and to get more people, more people that work with spatiotemporal type data like this. There are a few people working for the league office or within teams that have some expertise specifically with this type of data, just so that they can pull out some of those insights. I think, obviously much of that is kept very close to the vest within the teams themselves. Everyone wants to use this to gain an edge. So a lot of us don't know what the other teams are doing, but everyone wants to use this, as best they can to just help understand what's happening in a basketball game and to be able to objectively describe it by using data instead of just watching film. And just the pure logistics of running a basketball front office as well. Like there used to be guys that just had to watch a lot of film and tag a lot of things within a front office, video coordinators in sports code, just like tapping away for hours and hours, working all through the night to tag all these things. Now we can automate a lot of that away for them and free them up to do more player development work, or, to think more about strategy instead of just having to identify all of these things that are happening in a basketball game. Like a lot of that we can do for them now. So it's been a big help. And, given the dynamics, within all of sports of, there's always been this little bit of tension, the push and pull between analytics and eye test and, old schools, people from the sport and in this new breed, but us being able to like free up a lot of their time by automating away a lot of their work is like, just an additional benefit, like to get buy-in from what we're doing.
Thank you for that, Aaron. It does make me wonder, though, what do the grad assistants or fourth assistants do now to cut their teeth? But Seth, I want to come over to you. Aaron talked a lot about how this can be used team specific. Thinking about how a coach can utilize this data and thus how the players can interact even with their own performance to get and gain an edge, at least within their own game. If we think about it, though, for more external parties, people like writers or even broadcasters, what do you see the value added for those people who are constantly talking about specific teams or trying to paint a picture, write a story about what's happening on the court?
First of all, I think those are kind of the same thing. The analysis you're doing inside a team is, it's telling a story to kind of a different audience. But the thing that this kind of data does is it does allow you to tell a story in the language of the sport much more than traditional box score data is, or play-by-play data. Play-by-play information tells you the what, when, who, maybe where something happened. With tracking data and kind of this, someone else who's worked in the space called the semantic layer, in terms of pulling these actions, these combinations of movements out. These are sport-specific words that you're pulling out of a specific set of actions that then tell you much more about the how of something that happened. And for anyone who's interacting with the sport at a professional level, the how is substantially more important to not just figuring out what happened, but what will happen in the future, which is really when you're doing the analysis, like there is a bit of, okay, we want to understand but what happened. But the reason you're doing that is instrumental towards, either understanding the game better. On the media side, it's who do we think is going to win tomorrow? Maybe it's, there are more kind of gaming applications of it. Like, what do we think this is a good bet or not, and why? And obviously on the team side, where are we? Where will we continue to play if we play like this? If we remove some of the variants that we can identify, and what can we do to do things better? What are we not doing well? What can we do better? Just have so many more tools to address that now by having the sort of the language of the sport. Namita has talked about event data, and really a lot of what this is doing is creating a much richer set of events, things that we know that if we were saying this is something that happened in a basketball game, that was a screen. That's important, I know. But we didn't have a way of like noticing every time that happened before, and not just every time that happened in one game, but every time that happened in every game, and say intelligent things about what that means. And with this much richer data, we can start to do that. And as I think, as Aaron said, it's almost a limitless trove of things we can do. It's sort of the imagination of what words we want to pull out, and then the non-trivial technical aspect of sort of doing that at the level of quality required.
Indeed. And so, Seth, I like that you were, talking about these sport-specific words, or the language, and how we can essentially paint the picture. And, you mentioned the how. And so, Namita, I want to come back to you. We're going to go back to hockey now, because it seems like hockey is relatively new to this and tracking data and bringing it into the culture. But organizations like the Seattle Kraken, brand new NHL team, seem to really be taking this on. And so you mentioned defense. I got very excited, but what are some other areas that you think can be impacted by this type of data in hockey in particular?
I mean, there's just so many facets. It's hard to, list all of them. I really did like what Aaron said about kind of one of the first and most immediate functions of tracking data can often be to just make everyone's life a bit easier. So I'll give it a good example of like, even now, the NHL provides us with essentially the docs. So we can see, in an app, like where guys are on the ice over the course of a game. And that's just really helpful for like seeing if a guy's playing center or wing, right? And it sounds like a basic question, but a lot of the time, like those are the types of questions that you have to answer when you're trying to figure out, all sorts of broader and higher level hockey questions, such as, should we acquire this player? Would he fit into our team? So, especially not just for statisticians, but also for video analysts, like being able to take away some of the most just kind of obvious questions and allow them to have more time to spend on other things, I think is a great function of tracking data that you can see kind of almost immediately once it's implemented. And then, I alluded to it earlier, but things like expected goals in hockey. So really trying to measure the danger of every scoring chance, that's the type of thing where people might wonder, okay, what's going to happen to that as tracking data becomes more mainstream? And I think, this notion of some shots and some chances being more dangerous than other shots and chances, like that's never going to go away. But what it does is provides an additional huge breadth of information to make that more accurate. So with the just simple event-based location, we might just know like where the shot is taking place and the angle and some other sort of more basic features about it. But with the tracking data, we can know everything that got to that point, whether there was a great pass beforehand, where the goalie is in relation to the shot. So all sorts of more precise tidbits of information that can really give us a better sense of, was this shot actually really dangerous? We can also even sort of see, like when you see, at like the skills competition, for example, like a shot going 100 miles per hour, like that's the type of information that, we'll now get to have basically all the time. And so we can see like who are the most dangerous shooters. But like I really could go on. It does feel limitless. I guess like, from that sense, I mentioned defense first, even the offensive side. There's a lot of things that we can take away and add to our understanding of the game. But I think where we'll see maybe the biggest kind of improvement relative to where we are currently is I expect the defensive side of the game, just because, I think based on the data we have now, like we already have some sense of, like I mentioned, the most dangerous shooters in the game. We can add more precision to that understanding, but on the defensive side, I think it's more the Wild West right now in terms of how people understand that and sort of forecast that moving forward. What one player does in one defensive system versus what he would do in another, I think is a really hard question to answer. And I don't think it's ever going to become an easy question to answer, but I think tracking data can really help bridge some of those gaps in knowledge and expectation.
Thank you for that. And I just want to reset this virtual room, Clubhouse and Twitter Spaces style. So we are obviously here at the Ottawa Hockey Analytics Conference. You just heard from Namita Nandakumar. We also have Aaron Blackshear and Seth Partnow. I'm your moderator, Erica Lindsay Ayala. And I just want to remind you, it's also in the chat, but if you have specific questions, we're going to be using the Q&A function. So we are going to be coming up on that portion, the Q&A soon. So if you have something, pop it in the Q&A, and then myself and other people, we can get around to that. Okay, so let's get back to this. Now, a few of you already have mentioned the types of roles that either tracking can, I don't know if replaces, in some ways maybe replace, but it can substitute some of how things have been done prior to, especially on the film side of things. But Seth, I want to come to you first for this. Let's talk about, as you mentioned, we've talked about the how a lot, but now, what exactly does it take to track data? What are some of the skill sets that yourself and other people who are doing this right now in sports, what does it take to do this work in sports?
That's a great question. I think that, the sort of analytics 1.0 was sort of one person who could, do some analysis and maybe do some statistical programming and could do a little bit of web development and could cobble together a database, and there was sort of a one-man band almost. Now as the sort of the discipline has become more accepted, more resourced. I mean, those are like 5 different jobs that I just mentioned. I mean, you talked about the sort of the video analyst, the sort of the analysis role is sort of sits between analytics and video / eye test to be able to translate the insights that kind of you gain from kind of the I don't want to say more technical people, but more defined technical roles. Obviously, data engineers and people who can structure, store, import, export, make the data pipeline work. It's the unsexiest part of it, but probably the most underappreciated, because it's the sort of thing that makes everything else that an analytics group do works seamlessly. And when something breaks, that's often where. And then obviously there's the sort of the statisticians and modelers who are very thankful for the data engineers for getting and cleaning and maintaining the data so that they can build their models. They can go deeper into the data to start, pulling out these concepts that we've all been talking about. So it's and I'm sure I'm forgetting one or two, but there's it really is the intersection of 5 or 6 different kind of disciplines and professions that work together to kind of create and especially communicate actionable insights to other people in the organization, whether it's coaches, front office folks, or in some sports more than others at this point. I think in the sports that we have worked in, direct communication to players is probably not yet. Baseball has seen that. And we might get there, or maybe it's always going to go through sort of coaching layer before it gets to players. But that's sort of a different discussion, and we don't have to go into that now.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot actually about baseball while all of you are talking. That is my first love, despite not considering myself a data person. But there are just so many numbers all the time, and I as you all are talking about tracking, I also started thinking about technology, because I don't know if there are any other former athletes here, but tracking, at least when I was in college and playing softball, was me sitting on the bench with a pencil and like, okay, the ball goes here, and and then we would scheme our defense. Anyway, enough about my college experience. We do have some questions here, so I'm going to run through these. And Seth, I think you hit on this a little bit, but Mike is asking, is tracking data helping the pro players in any way with respect to skill development?
So we've seen a ton of that in baseball. I think that it's most helpful for kind of rote physical skills. We've sort of seen it with pitching first with the high-speed cameras, and you can examine grip and get spin rates and stuff like that. That's where it's had the most sort of impact. I think it's better at identifying things than necessarily teaching things when we start to get into sort of cognitive and decision-making aspects of a sport. So I think that we're just scratching the surface on how it can help with really the playing basketball, playing hockey, not just shooting a basketball or skating, the skating technique bits that maybe the sort of optical stuff might most easily help with. I don't think anyone's totally figured it out yet, but a lot of people are working on it.
And we have another question. This will go to Aaron and Namita. For people working for teams, if all teams have access to the full data for themselves and opponents, and thus access to data isn't a competitive edge, why not release data to the public?
So first of all, I'll say that the decision of who gets to access data is so far above my pay grade. So I'll just put that out there. But to kind of push back on a part of that question a little bit, what I'll say is like access to the data for every team, that part, I guess, is equal. What's not equal is the amount of investment in sort of analyzing that data, hiring people who are experts in being able to, as Seth was alluding to, go from processing and maintaining, the data in databases, to creating statistical models, to figuring out how to kind of apply that knowledge to making hockey decisions. There's so many parts of that process that I think, are just certainly non-trivial in basically my entire life. And what I would say is, I think you're going to see the biggest benefits accrued to the teams that invest the most in it. Tracking data is not easy to work with. It is, like I said, the biggest data set that you can really find in sports. And you kind of need a lot of expertise and experience to be able to consistently glean useful insights. That's not to, scare anyone. I do think that with, things like Big Data Cup, Big Data Bowl in the NFL, like there's clearly ways for, even if you're not sort of well-versed in working with it yet, there's ways to get your feet wet to understand how to work with it. But it's certainly a process that takes a lot of time and a lot of investment from a team to be able to really get the most out of it.
Yeah, she hit the nail on the head, and that just having the data only does so much for you, so like, the idea that, it's equal amongst teams, just because every team is going to get this 500 gigabyte dump of JSON data of XY coordinates, like, no, like that's, you've got to hire the right people. You've got to have a good plan as an organization for how you're going to utilize it. And that's going to start very slow. So there's not, just having the data is not necessarily making the teams equal. And also, like Namita said, like way above me as far as, who's deciding making the data public. The NBA tracking data used to be very public. It was available through their public API if you knew how to find it. That stopped sometime in 2016. I believe is, somewhat related to like the move from StatsInc to Second Spectrum. This is, all of these sports leagues are a business at the end of the day, and our partners are businesses as well. And so like there may come a day when all of the tracking data is available again. NBA.com does have a lot of really useful tools for summaries of that tracking data, not the raw data itself, but some really useful information that's gleaned from it. And that's available through their public APIs. You can pull it down and manipulate it, as much as you want. You can't get the full raw XY coordinates like you used to. There is a few people that pulled a lot of that down and saved it when it used to be publicly available. And so you can find that data out there. So there's a few people that have GitHub repos with the data. So yeah, if someone in the public wants to, become well-versed in working with basketball tracking data, there's a decent amount of it out there that, it's a few years old, but, XY coordinates are XY coordinates. You're not going to have anything current, but you can at least, get up to speed with what it takes to sort of manipulate and summarize this data. And it's not easy. It's not, just like someone who just is like crunching a few numbers in Excel is not going to pull that data down and be able to really do anything useful with it. It's difficult data to work with.
Yeah, and Aaron, I think is at the top of your answer there, you were also talking about some of the different software or database programs, and that's a question that we have in here from Ben. So I'll start with you and anyone else that wants to hit on this. But what are some of the software or database programs most widely used professionally?
Yeah, so Python and R, for when it comes to analysis, are there's if you go on Twitter, there's a lot of people arguing for one or the other, but a programming language is a programming language. Everyone has their own personal preferences. I would say most teams are probably using some of both. I'm a Python person myself, but dabble in R here and there. SQL for databases, of course, that's fundamental. Like most of your data is going to be in a relational database. With the introduction of tracking data, though, that's less true. This data is so massive, it doesn't really lend itself to like a relational database. So you've got to use some other, I don't like the term, but quote unquote big data tools to work with this, at least to do it efficiently. It's a challenge, though. I would say, like, I don't think anyone has the perfect solution for that. Like, I don't know what they're using internally at Second Spectrum, but it's an ongoing challenge to have the systems that are capable of making this data accessible to do analysis on. But so generally speaking, though, for the question, Python and R for modeling and analysis. Python and R people will, will kind of dump on Excel a little bit, but like you're still throwing data in Excel here and there and doing some simple stuff. And then like Seth mentioned, there's web development, like you've got to make the data accessible. You got to make the analysis accessible to the decision makers. And so you need front end people to like I can do some web development. I have zero training or experience or skills when it comes to like, user experience. And so, that's a really important thing as well. And I think for an area where a lot of teams haven't invested enough, like it's a cliche at this point to say, the best analysis is useless if you can't explain it to a coach, but that's more than just explaining and communicating. It's also like having really useful tools where they can easily get the information that they need as quickly as possible. Because NBA coaches work so hard and they work so long, and if it's taken more than a few clicks to get what they need, again, you're going to lose them. So you've got to make things really accessible and easy to use and understand.
Yeah, indeed. And actually going off of what you just said, Aaron, there's a question here from Kevin. How do teams sort out coaching systems from player abilities or tendencies, thinking about especially the defensive side if teams are looking at acquiring a player or getting a new coach that does tracking data? How does that play a role in informing some of these decisions, do you think? Maybe, Namita, we can go to you for this one.
Yeah, this is a great question. It's definitely one that I've thought about extensively because I feel like we've spent so much time talking about like tracking data has limitless potential, and in a lot of ways it really does. One of the things that I ran into in the NFL was like, okay, what's a question that tracking data can't answer, especially when you're looking at, let's say, a defensive back and how he's being used in coverage. You can see what he did with the tracking data really granularly, really amazingly. You can't see what he was asked to do. And no one's going to tell you that. The opposing coach is not going to be like, oh, by the way, I told him to do this. So you can judge how well he followed my instructions. So from that perspective, there is a little bit of a gap and a blind spot there. And I think that's where we can never fully we're never going to move ourselves away from really the subject matter experts, the real the scouts and the video analysts and stuff who know hockey and systems, because I think that's kind of the area where I try to lean on them as much as possible to sort of figure out, what are the differences in how teams are being asked to play? Is that something we can see through the data? How does that translate from team to team? Basically, that's the type of question where no matter how granular the tracking data gets, you can't know, for example, what a player is being asked to do. And you kind of have to infer that through a lot of other means as well.
Mm-hmm. And I want to stick with you, Namita, just for a moment, but also we have a few more questions in here. I'm not sure we're going to try and get to as many as possible, but if any of the panelists, if you see a question that you're very called to answer, you can also engage in the Q&A box. But there's a question from a hockey statistician. So that's why we're going to stick with you for this one, Namita. But thinking about what tracking information would you see as essential, for maybe someone that has limited resources, but really wants to start using tracking data, where would you have them start?
That is tough. I don't know. I mean, I guess what I would say is I think one of the tricky things about tracking data is, anything that you want to do ends up taking at least 6 months longer than you expected to take. So one of the things, I know that like the NHL in conjunction with AWS recently released like a face-off model. I don't know the details of it, but I think, there were questions about like, oh, does tracking data add a lot of information or value to this? And it's not even, I think, about that as it is more so like you have to find a sort of manageable place to start. So as much as I, am sitting here saying like, oh, I'd love to solve defense. Like, I know that's not the first thing I'm going to be able to do with this data. So I think, finding ways that you can really cut down and isolate situations of interest is helpful. I certainly learned in the NFL, like it's much easier to be able to cut down to just like the part of a play that you're interested in. So, maybe the pass rush, you can just look at the snap to when the quarterback releases the ball. So something like that, something like a face-off. So you can try to start basically with these sort of discrete events and situations and have it be more manageable, and then use that type of project as sort of building blocks and first steps toward something more complicated and more comprehensive.
Thank you for that, Namita. Seth, I'd like to come to you for these next two questions. I think they're very similar from Nick and Riker. It's asking about tracking devices and how that relates to, especially what we have come to know as something as a NBA phenomenon, and that being load management or being able to negotiate, how we integrate players coming off of an injury, things of that nature.
I think that we are collecting a lot more data than we know how to use. There's all kinds of things, both wearables, optical, scans, devices that we have internally that are creating massive amounts of data. But like injuries are hard, like they're random. So you can make some reasonable guesses, but you never have enough of a data set to know if you're right or not, especially considering that the population that we are sort of examining are, like, by definition, physical outliers. So this is something that teams are doing sinking a lot of effort into. Starting to see some returns, I would say, but I wouldn't say that it's nearly to the level as we tend to be with sort of production. I guess the dichotomy between like the sports science and like how the nomenclature for that is always weird, but I guess we'd call it like player production versus kind of sports science and medical applications. The production aspect is we're significantly further ahead. Interestingly, this is an area where kind of like European and Australian sports are actually went that side first and are just now more getting into the performance aspect of it. They kind of started at sports science. So maybe if you had an Aussie on this call, they'd be able to answer that question a bit better, because really a lot of the sports science insight, for whatever reason, has like come out of Australia.
Oh, that's very interesting. I did not know that. And I am not Australian, so I can't hold you down there. But there's a question from Tim here, and Aaron, I'd like to send this over your way. But how far away are we from a big breakthrough? Is the question from that we can take away from tracking data?
I would say, I don't think there is necessarily a big breakthrough coming. I think it's just going to be slow and steady progress. But I feel like what tracking data is going to do is it's going to allow us to continually make progress. Like, I feel like we are very far from plateauing when it comes to like how we're going to like continue to gain more insight into our sports. Just because, like, all of us have said, it's almost limitless, and it's like so largely untapped already that there's just I have so many ideas of like things we want to do if I had all the time in the world, and and just like this army of analysts and sports scientists and statisticians and modelers. Like, there's so many things you can tease out of this, like just at the smallest level. And I think Namita made a really good point before, in that like in some ways it's like analysis paralysis. You can just be overwhelmed with like the number of things you would like to know and what you can do with this. And so you just have to start with just small, discrete, easily identifiable, as objective as possible things that you can answer, like in a basketball context of just, okay, I want to know how good this guy is at closing out. So I'm going to use the tracking data and find out every time when he was on the weak side, and his responsibility was the corner shooter, and like how quickly did he react when the pass came, and how good was the closeout, like just small things like that. And then you just continue to build on those until like eventually you're telling a full story of what happened in a game and understanding all like again, getting back to defense, how hard it is to measure just all those little things. As you accumulate them, you start to tell a more complete story of who is good at defense, and not only who but why. The why is the part we really don't know. And so it's like, so there's not necessarily that there's going to be this aha, we have solved basketball moment that's coming, or hockey or football, but like what this is giving us is just a long runway where we can see just continual improvement, continual accomplishments, just one after the other. We're going to just continue to learn more and more, and without plateauing, I think, for a long time.
I think that's a really great place to leave it. I want to thank all of you, Seth, Aaron, and of course, Namita, for joining us. And of course, to the Ottawa Hockey Analytics Conference for inviting me to come and moderate this panel. But we'll turn it over now. Thank you, and apologies to those questions that we didn't get to, but hopefully you can stick around for the conference, and we'll have a good time in the chat elsewhere.